The morning after my daughter's wedding, the wedding I wasn't invited to, my phone rang. Claire didn't even say hello, didn't say she missed me, didn't say she wished I'd been there. She just said, "Mom, Julian and I want to spend our honeymoon at the Vineyard. Can you send us the gate code and make sure the cellar's stocked?" I sat there with the phone to my ear, staring out across the vines that had been in my family for 3 generations. My only child had gotten married without me, and the first thing she wanted was the keys to Rossi Vineyards. She tried to dress it up, of course, said it was romantic, that she wanted to start her marriage where she grew up, running barefoot through these rows. Said Julian thought the estate would give them more privacy than a crowded resort. But I heard what was underneath. He wanted inside my gates. He wanted a taste of the life I'd built with my father's hands and my husband's sweat. And Claire, my Claire, was repeating his words like they were her own. I smiled into the phone and told her not to worry. I'd take care of it. Then I hung up, poured myself a glass of my best Cabernet, and started planning a wedding gift. Not flowers, not a check, but something they would never forget. Before we continue, please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and subscribe to Never Too Old channel. We're creating a community of incredible people who know that our best chapters can happen at any age. Now, back to the story. I've been walking these rows since I could toddle. My father planted the first Cabernet vines when I was 3 years old, back when this valley was still more about prunes than prestige. Antonio and I expanded the vineyard when we married, 40 acres that now produces some of the finest wine in Napa Valley, worth $15 million according to the last appraisal. Not that I'd ever sell. The house sits at the center of it all, built from Sonoma fieldstone with wide terraces that catch the morning light. Antonio designed it himself, sketching plans on napkins at the kitchen table while Claire did her homework. She was maybe 8 then, always underfoot during harvest, her small hands stained purple from helping sort grapes. Those were the good years. Claire would spend entire summers here, learning to identify each varietal by smell alone. We'd sit under the old oak tree after dinner, sharing a glass of wine, well, grape juice for her, while I told stories about her grandfather's early struggles with phylloxera and drought. She loved those stories then, called herself the Grape Princess, and announced to anyone who'd listen that she'd run Rossi Vineyards someday. But somewhere along the way, Claire decided the city suited her better. She got her marketing degree and took a job in San Francisco, visiting less and less. Still loved the vineyard, she said, just preferred to love it from a distance. I understood. Not everyone's built for the long days and dirt under the fingernails that grape growing requires. What I didn't understand was Julian. The first time she brought him home, he arrived carrying a bottle of 2015 Barolo Giacomo Conterno, which retail for about $300. "I thought we should drink something worthy of the occasion," he said, that smooth smile never wavering as he surveyed my kitchen like he was appraising it. He was handsome in that careful way some men cultivate, silver at the temples, perfectly pressed shirt, Italian leather shoes that had never seen honest dirt. Claire practically glowed beside him, hanging on his every observation about the terroir and the investment potential of Napa Valley real estate. "You've built something remarkable here, Eleanor," he said over dinner, gesturing toward the windows where the vineyard stretched into twilight. "This kind of operation, with proper capitalization and modern marketing, could really scale. Have you considered partnership opportunities?" I kept my smile pleasant and asked him to pass the salt, but something cold settled in my stomach that had nothing to do with the wine. Claire didn't notice. She was too busy watching Julian taste my 2018 reserve, waiting for his approval like a schoolgirl. When he pronounced it quite sophisticated for a boutique operation, she beamed. That night, after they'd gone back to Claire's apartment in the city, I walked the vineyard alone. The vines whispered in the evening breeze, the same sound they'd made when my father and I would check for pests by moonlight. These roots ran deep, deeper than charm, deeper than whatever spell Julian had cast over my daughter. I should have trusted that feeling, should have asked more questions, pushed harder when Claire started parroting his phrases about maximizing potential and strategic partnerships. But she was 35 and in love, and I'd learned long ago that there are some mistakes you have to let your children make. I just never thought she'd make them at the altar. I found out about my daughter's engagement from Napa Valley Lifestyle's Instagram feed. There she was in a cream silk dress, Julian's arm around her waist, both of them laughing at what looked like a garden party. The caption read, "Vinter heiress Claire Rossi announces engagement to wine investor Julian Hale, celebrated this weekend at the beautiful Hale family estate." I stared at my phone screen until the image blurred. 47 comments already from people I'd known for decades, all congratulating my daughter on news I was learning from social media. The call came 2 hours later. "Mom, I meant to call you earlier." "Congratulations," I said, my voice steady. "You look radiant in the photos." A pause. "You saw them already?" "The whole valley's seen them, sweetheart." "Oh." Her voice went smaller. "I'm sorry. Julian's parents wanted to keep it family only, just immediate family. You understand, right? They didn't want it to turn into a big production. Family only." I let those words settle. "Of course. When's the wedding?" "We're planning something small and intimate. Very simple." "Simple?" I swallowed the hurt and told her I was happy for her. We talked about dates and venues in the vague way people do when they're not really making plans together. When I hung up, I went out to check the irrigation lines, letting the familiar work steady my hands. The humiliation burned, but I buried it. Claire was in love. Julian's family had money and connections. Of course they'd want to control the narrative, make it about them. I'd raised Claire to be gracious, and grace sometimes meant accepting slights with dignity. I threw myself into harvest preparations. The Cabernet was nearly ready, and Manuel needed direction on the picking crews. Rosa wanted to discuss replanting the south slope. Work has always been my refuge. When your heart hurts, your hands can still tend vines. 3 weeks passed. I heard nothing about wedding plans. Then Rosa came in from the mailbox with the newspaper, shaking her head. "Senora Eleanor, you should see this." The St. Helena Stars Society page featured a small article, "Quiet Wedding for Local Couple." Below it, a photo of Claire and Julian emerging from the courthouse, his parents flanking them like bodyguards. The caption read, "Claire Rossi and Julian Hale wed in intimate ceremony yesterday." Yesterday. My daughter had gotten married yesterday, and I'd learned about it from the newspaper. I sat at my kitchen table and read the article 3 times. The bride wore a simple blue dress and carried white roses. The groom's parents hosted a small reception at their St. Helena estate for immediate family. Immediate family. There it was again. The phone didn't ring that day, or the next. Claire didn't call to share her joy, didn't send photos, didn't even text to let me know she'd changed her name. I learned my daughter was married the way strangers did, from the newspaper. On the 3rd day, my phone finally rang. "Mom?" Claire's voice was bright, breathless. "I hope I'm not calling too early." "Not at all." I set down my coffee cup. "How are you, sweetheart?" "Oh, wonderful. Julian and I were just talking over breakfast, and we had this amazing idea." She paused, and I could hear him murmuring in the background, "We want to spend our honeymoon at the Vineyard. Isn't that romantic?" I told Julian how I used to run through the vines as a little girl, and he thinks it would be so much more private than some crowded resort. I gripped the phone tighter. 3 days. She'd been married 3 days, and this was the first time she'd called me. "The guest house would be perfect," she continued, "and maybe you could make sure the wine cellar's stocked." He's excited to try some of the older vintages. Something about the way she said it, not "we're excited" or "I'd love to share this place with him," made my chest tighten. "Of course," I heard myself say. "When were you thinking?" "This weekend? I know it's short notice, but the weather's supposed to be perfect." I closed my eyes and saw Claire at 8 years old, purple-stained and giggling as she helped me sort grapes. Saw her at 16, rolling her eyes at my stories about her grandfather but listening anyway. Saw her at 25, bringing college friends home for harvest, proud to show them the tasting room Antonio had built with his own hands. Now she was asking for the gate code like I was a hotel concierge. "I'll have Rosa prepare the guest house," I said, "and I'll make sure you have everything you need." "Thank you, Mom." The relief in her voice was audible. "Oh, and could you send me the gate code?" Julian doesn't want to have to stop at the main house. Of course he didn't. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time. Through the window, the morning sun was hitting the vines just right, turning the leaves gold and green. This was the view Claire had woken up to every morning of her childhood. These were the sounds she'd fallen asleep to: the wind through the leaves, the distant hum of equipment, the soft voices of workers who'd known her since she was born. But Julian didn't want to stop at the main house, didn't want to share a meal with me, didn't want to hear stories about the Vineyard's history, didn't want Claire to remember that this place had a heart before it had a price tag. That's when I understood what was really happening. This wasn't about a romantic honeymoon. This was reconnaissance. Julian wanted to walk my property, taste my wine, and figure out what he'd married into. I poured myself a glass of my 2010 reserve, the wine Antonio and I had made the year before he died, and started making plans of my own. The honeymoon call came exactly as I'd expected, polite, brief, and entirely about logistics. Claire thanked me for preparing the guest house, mentioned how much they'd enjoyed the wine, and then got to the real reason she was calling. "Mom, Julian and I have been talking about the future." Her voice had that careful quality it got when she was delivering prepared remarks. "About the vineyard, I mean. The succession planning." I set down my pruning shears and walked back toward the house. "What about it?" "Well, you're 71 now, and Julian thinks we think maybe it's time to start transitioning some of the operational responsibilities. Nothing major, just paperwork, really. If the vineyard was in my name, we could attract investors, expand the operation, take it global." The words tumbled out like she'd rehearsed them. Probably had, with Julian coaching her from across their hotel room or wherever newlyweds went to plot taking over their inheritance. "The vineyard's doing fine as it is," I said. I know. But Julian has connections with distributors in Europe, and his family has experience with agricultural investments. They think Rossi Vineyards has incredible potential. They think. His family. Julian has connections. In 3 minutes of conversation, my daughter had managed to not express a single opinion of her own. "What exactly are you proposing?" "Just a transfer of ownership. You'd still be involved, of course. Still live in the house, still oversee the day-to-day operations, but on paper, legally, it would be mine. Our accountant says it makes sense for tax purposes." Our accountant. They'd been married a week and already had a joint accountant. "I'll think about it," I said. "Really? Oh, that's wonderful. Julian will be so pleased. He says you're being very forward-thinking about this." After I hung up, I walked out to the oak tree where Claire and I used to sit during summer evenings. The trunk was scarred now from decades of wind and weather, but its roots ran deep enough to find water even in drought years. Julian called it forward-thinking when I considered handing over 3 generations of work to a man I'd met 4 times. Over the next month, the calls became more frequent. Claire would mention how complicated the vineyard's finances were, how much work I was doing that could be simplified with proper management. She'd drop Julian's name into every conversation. Julian thought this. Julian suggested that. Julian knew someone who could help. But it was what she stopped doing that told me everything. No more surprise visits on weekends, no more calls just to chat about my day or hers. No more questions about the harvest or the new plantings or the stories I used to tell about her grandfather. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after the harvest dinner Rosa had prepared for the crew, when I heard Claire's voice drifting from the upstairs bathroom. She was on the phone, speaking louder than usual, probably had it on speaker while fixing her makeup. I shouldn't have listened. Should have turned on the faucet or made noise to give her privacy. But something in her tone made me freeze with a wine glass half dried in my hands. "Julian? Sorry, I'm putting you on speaker. I'm touching up my lipstick. How's it going with your mother?" His voice was crisp, businesslike. "She's being stubborn about the deed transfer. I've tried everything you suggested, the tax benefits, the expansion opportunities. She just keeps saying she needs time to think." A pause. "We don't have time, Claire. My investors are getting impatient. They want to see movement on this by December, or they're walking." "Investors?" I gripped the phone tighter. I know, but she's not stupid, Julian. If I push too hard, she'll get suspicious. Then don't push. Just remind her how much work this place is for someone her age. How isolated she is out here. Maybe it's time to start talking about assisted living options, somewhere closer to the city where you can keep an eye on her. My blood went cold. I don't know if I can do that. It feels wrong. It's not wrong, it's practical. Look, Claire, your mother had her turn running this place. Now it's ours. She can either be part of the transition or she can be an obstacle to it, but either way, the vineyard is going to be ours. You're right. It's just, she's my mother, and I'm your husband. Who matters more? The silence stretched long enough that I thought they'd hung up. Then Claire's voice, smaller now. You do, of course you do. Good. Now I've been thinking. Maybe you should mention that voicemail from your cousin in Portland, the one about her mother-in-law's fall. Really emphasize how dangerous it is for elderly people to live alone in these big properties. Julian, I don't have a cousin in Portland. You do now. Use your imagination, sweetheart. Sometimes you have to tell people what they need to hear. My hands were shaking, but my mind was crystal clear for the first time in months. Julian wasn't just after my vineyard. He was teaching my daughter to lie to me, manipulate me, gaslight me into believing I was too old and fragile to manage my own life. And Claire, my Claire, was going along with it. When she came back downstairs, I was drying wine glasses like nothing had happened. The crew did beautiful work this year, I said. Your grandfather would have been proud. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Mom, I've been thinking, maybe we should talk about your long-term plans. I worry about you out here all alone. I smiled back and told her we'd talk soon, but I already knew exactly what my long-term plans were going to be. The next morning, I called my lawyer. Martin Delgado had handled Antonio's estate and helped me navigate the legal maze when we'd incorporated the vineyard 20 years ago. He was the kind of lawyer who still kept paper files and remembered his clients' birthdays, old school in the best possible way. Eleanor, good to hear from you. How's the harvest looking? Beautiful. Martin, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to keep it completely confidential. A pause. Of course. What do you need? I want you to run a background check on Julian Hale. Financial records, business history, everything you can find, and I want it done quietly. Any particular reason? I stared out at the vines, watching Manuel adjust the irrigation lines with the same careful attention he'd given this place for 15 years. Call it maternal intuition. What Martin found made my stomach turn. Julian Hale had left a trail of failed ventures across 3 states, a wine import business that had folded owing 6 figures to suppliers, a restaurant investment group that had collapsed when his partners discovered forged financial documents, 2 previous engagements to women from wealthy families, both broken off when the women's fathers had hired investigators. But the worst part was the pattern. Julian would court women with family businesses or significant inheritances, get close enough to gain access to their assets, then systematically drain what he could before moving on to the next target. There's more, Martin said when he brought me the files. He's currently being sued by 3 different creditors, and there are shell companies in his name that appear to be vehicles for moving money around without proper documentation. I flipped through page after page of financial records, lawsuits, and testimonials from his previous victims. One woman in Oregon had lost her family's apple orchard. Another in Washington had nearly lost her vineyard before her brother intervened. He's not just a gold digger, I said. He's a predator. That's about the size of it. Eleanor, you need to show this to Claire. I shook my head. She won't believe me. She'll think I'm making it up because I don't like him. Then what do you want to do? I closed the file and looked out at the vineyard that 3 generations of Rossi women had protected. I want to let him think he's winning, and then I want to destroy him. The first step was making Julian believe I was weakening. I started calling Claire more often, mentioning how tired I was, how overwhelming the vineyard management had become. I let slip that I'd been having trouble sleeping, that I sometimes forgot things. Maybe you're right about getting help with the business side, I told her during one carefully orchestrated phone call. All these regulations and tax codes, it's getting harder to keep track of everything. I could practically hear her excitement. Mom, that's wonderful. Julian knows some excellent business managers who could take that burden off your shoulders. Julian's business managers. Of course he did. Meanwhile, I was building my own team. Martin introduced me to a forensic accountant who specialized in financial fraud. I hired a private investigator who had experience with con artists targeting family businesses. I even reached out to the women Julian had scammed before, women who were more than happy to share their stories and documentation. The hardest part was watching Claire transform into someone I barely recognized. She started dressing differently, more expensive clothes, jewelry I'd never seen before. Her vocabulary changed too, filled with business jargon that sounded unnatural coming from her mouth. Julian thinks we should modernize the tasting room, she told me during one visit. Maybe add some interactive elements, really capitalize on the experiential wine tourism market. Capitalize. Experiential market. These weren't Claire's words. But I played my part perfectly. I asked questions about Julian's suggestions, expressed concern about my ability to manage such changes on my own, even mentioned that maybe it was time to think about what would happen to the vineyard when I was gone. We could structure it as a gradual transition, Claire said, her eyes bright with something that might have been greed or might have been love. You'd still have input on all the major decisions, but Julian and I would handle the day-to-day operations. Day-to-day operations, like choosing which wines to produce, which distributors to work with, which workers to employ. The soul of the vineyard, dressed up in corporate speak. By November, Julian had become bold enough to visit the vineyard without Claire, ostensibly to assess the infrastructure needs for their planned expansion. I watched from my kitchen window as he walked the property with a notebook, taking photos, measuring distances between buildings. He was cataloging his future assets. That evening, he knocked on my door with a bottle of wine and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Eleanor, I brought you something special. He held up a bottle of 2019 Screaming Eagle Cabernet, retail price around $400. I thought we should celebrate. What are we celebrating? The future. Claire tells me you're ready to start the transition process. I want you to know how much I respect what you've built here, and how committed I am to preserving your legacy. Preserving my legacy. While he planned to sell it to investors and turn it into a corporate cash cow, I opened the wine and poured 2 glasses, listening as Julian laid out his vision for Rossi Vineyards. Expanded production, international distribution, maybe even a luxury resort component to really maximize the property's potential. Of course, you'd always have a place here, he said. Maybe a nice cottage somewhere on the property, close enough that you could still be involved but far enough that you'd have privacy. A cottage, so I could watch strangers run my family's vineyard from a distance. It sounds like you've given this a lot of thought, I said. I have. I love Claire, and I love this place. I want to make sure both have the brightest possible future. I smiled and refilled his glass. Julian, I think we understand each other perfectly. And we did. He understood that he was about to steal everything I'd worked for, and I understood that I was about to make him pay for it in ways he couldn't even imagine. The Napa Valley Wine Society's Winter Gala was exactly the kind of event Julian lived for. 200 of the Valley's most influential winemakers, distributors, and investors gathered in the St. Helena Community Center, all of them potential connections for an ambitious man with expensive taste. I hadn't planned to attend, usually avoided these affairs like the plague, preferring to let my wine speak for itself. But Martin had insisted. You need to be seen, he'd said. Let people think everything's normal while we finish gathering evidence. So there I was, wearing the black dress I'd bought for Antonio's funeral, and trying to look like a woman who wasn't planning anyone's destruction. Julian worked the room like a politician running for office. I watched him from across the hall, noting how he positioned himself near the bar where the biggest names in the valley would eventually migrate. His laugh was too loud, his handshake too firm, but most people seemed charmed by his enthusiasm. Claire hung on his arm in a red dress that probably cost more than Manuel made in a month. She was introducing Julian to everyone who'd known her since childhood, legitimizing his presence with her family connections. Eleanor Rossi. Patricia Caldwell appeared at my elbow, wine glass already half empty. I haven't seen you at one of these in years. How are you holding up? Patricia owned the vineyard adjacent to mine, and had been asking pointed questions about my succession plans ever since Julian had started showing up at industry events. I'm doing well, I said, enjoying retirement. Retirement? She looked genuinely surprised. But I thought Claire mentioned that Julian was taking over operations. Did she? Before Patricia could answer, the room went quiet. Julian was standing near the microphone, Claire beside him, both of them beaming like they'd just won the lottery. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian began, his voice carrying easily across the room. I hope you'll indulge me for just a moment. Claire and I have some exciting news to share. My stomach dropped. As many of you know, I've had the incredible privilege of joining the Rossi family. He squeezed Claire's hand, and tonight I'm thrilled to announce that Claire and I will be taking over full operational control of Rossi Vineyards, effective January 1st. The applause was polite but scattered. A few people glanced in my direction, confusion clear on their faces. We're planning an aggressive expansion, Julian continued, warming to his subject. International distribution, premium vineyard experiences, maybe even some hospitality components. The Rossi legacy is about to enter its most exciting chapter. More applause. Stronger this time. People loved a success story, especially one that promised to bring more attention to the valley. I stayed perfectly still, my wine glass steady in my hand. Around me, I could hear whispered conversations starting up. Did you know about this? I thought Eleanor was still running things. When did this happen? Julian was still talking, outlining his vision for turning Rossi Vineyards into what he called a world-class destination brand. Every word made my teeth ache, but I kept smiling, kept nodding when people approached to offer congratulations, kept playing the part of the gracious matriarch, stepping aside for the next generation, because Julian had just made a critical mistake. He'd announced his takeover publicly, in front of witnesses, before actually taking over anything. He'd committed himself to a timeline, made promises to investors and colleagues, painted himself into a corner where he had to deliver on his grand plans. The problem was, he didn't actually own Rossi Vineyards, didn't have any legal authority to make operational decisions, didn't even have access to the business accounts. He just promised the entire valley something he couldn't deliver. When the speeches ended and the crowd began to disperse, Julian and Claire made their way over to me. Julian's face was flushed with excitement and what looked like several glasses of champagne. Eleanor, what did you think? He asked. I hope I didn't speak out of turn, but I was so excited about the announcement that I couldn't help myself. It was very comprehensive, I said. Julian's been working on that presentation for weeks, Claire added. He wanted to make sure everyone understood the vision for the vineyard's future. I can see that. Although I'm curious about something, Julian. You mentioned effective January 1st. I don't recall us finalizing those particular details. For just a moment, his smile faltered. Well, obviously, we'll need to handle the paperwork and legal formalities, but I thought it was important to let people know where we're headed. Of course, and your investors, they must be pleased with the timeline. Very pleased. They're ready to move forward as soon as we have everything in order. I nodded thoughtfully. How exciting for everyone involved. We chatted for a few more minutes about logistics and timelines, Julian growing more animated with each topic. He was already mentally spending money he didn't have, making plans for property he didn't own. As we walked toward the parking lot, I realized Julian had given me something precious, a deadline. He'd publicly committed to taking over my vineyard by January 1st, which gave me exactly 5 weeks to destroy him. 5 weeks to make sure that when January 1st arrived, Julian Hale would have nothing left to take over. The legal letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by certified mail with the kind of formality that's meant to intimidate. Notice of Capacity Evaluation Request, read the letterhead from Morrison, Burke and Associates, a law firm I'd never heard of, but whose address placed them squarely in Julian's orbit. Rosa brought it to me while I was testing soil samples in the lab. Her face was tight with worry as she handed over the thick envelope. "This doesn't look good, Senora Eleanor." She was right. The letter, written in the bloodless language lawyer's favor, suggested that concerned family members had raised questions about my ability to manage complex financial decisions. It recommended a cognitive evaluation to ensure the well-being of all parties involved. Julian's signature was nowhere on the document, of course, but his fingerprints were all over it. I set the letter aside and went back to my soil samples. Let Julian play his games. I had work to do. The second wave came through industry whispers. Suddenly, every wine distributor in the valley had heard rumors that I was stepping down due to health concerns. Orders that had been placed months in advance were quietly being cancelled. The sommelier at Auberge du Soleil called to check in and mentioned that several people had told him Rossi Vineyards was changing ownership. Nothing wrong with the current management, I told him. But thanks for checking. Julian was working systematically to undermine my reputation, spreading carefully worded concerns that stopped just short of actionable slander. He was too smart to say anything directly, but the message was clear. Eleanor Rossi was no longer in control of her own business. The third attack was the most personal. Claire appeared at my door on a Thursday evening, her eyes red-rimmed and her usual composure cracked. "Mom, we need to talk." I led her to the kitchen and put the kettle on, waiting while she gathered herself. "Julian's been talking to estate planning attorneys," she began, then stopped. Started again. "He thinks you're making some questionable financial decisions, such as refusing to modernize the operation, turning down expansion opportunities, keeping too much capital tied up in equipment that could be liquidated." I poured hot water over tea bags and waited. "He's worried about you, Mom. We both are. You're 71 years old, running a $15 million business by yourself. What if something happens to you? What if you have a fall, or a stroke, or—" Her voice trailed off, but I heard the script underneath. The same phrases Julian had used on that phone call. What exactly is Julian proposing? A conservatorship. Just temporary, just until we can get everything properly organized. You'd still live here, still be involved in day-to-day operations, but Julian would handle the legal and financial aspects. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, saw the exhaustion in her face, the way her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her tea. She didn't want to be having this conversation any more than I wanted to hear it. "Claire," I said gently, "do you remember what your father used to say about trust?" She nodded, tears starting to gather. "He used to tell you that trust isn't something you get because you ask for it. It's something you earn by proving you deserve it." "I know. Julian hasn't earned my trust, sweetheart. And asking you to betray yours, that's not love. That's manipulation." The tears came then, quietly at first, then harder. Claire buried her face in her hands and cried the way she hadn't since she was a child. "I don't know what to do," she whispered. "He says if I don't support him on this, it means I don't trust his judgment, that I'm choosing you over him. And what do you think? I think I married someone I don't recognize anymore." I reached across the table and took her hands. "Then maybe it's time to figure out who you really married." After Claire left, I called Martin. It was after 9, but some conversations can't wait for business hours. "They're accelerating the timeline," I told him. "Julian's moving for conservatorship." "That's actually good news," Martin said. "Shows he's getting desperate. Desperate people make mistakes." "How long do we have?" "Based on what we've gathered so far, I'd say we're ready to move within the week." The private investigator found some very interesting connections between Julian and several failed investment schemes. "Seems our boy has a pattern of targeting wealthy older women." "How many others?" "At least 3 that we can document. All of them ended up losing significant assets before they figured out what was happening." I sat in my kitchen after we hung up, looking out at the vineyard in the moonlight. Julian thought he was tightening a noose around my neck, but what he'd actually done was given me the rope I needed to hang him with. 1 week. 7 days to destroy a man who thought he'd already won. I'd been patient long enough. The Napa Valley Wine Society's annual year-end dinner was held at Meadowood Resort, in the same dining room where I'd first met Antonio 45 years ago. He'd been a waiter then, charming and impossible, telling me the house wine was fine, but I deserved better. Tonight, the room buzzed with conversation about market trends and harvest yields. Julian held court near the bar, regaling investors with his plans for revolutionizing the boutique winery experience. Claire sat beside him in emerald silk, smiling at appropriate moments but staying quiet. She'd lost weight over the past month, and there were shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite hide. I took my usual table near the back, where I could observe without drawing attention. Martin sat across from me, looking perfectly ordinary in his 20-year-old navy suit. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. "Absolutely," I said. The evening followed its predictable rhythm. Wine pairings with each course, speeches about the challenges facing small vineyards, polite applause from people who'd had too much to drink. Julian checked his watch repeatedly, waiting for his moment. It came during dessert. "Ladies and gentlemen," called out the society president, a perpetually cheerful man named David, "we have a special presentation tonight from one of our newest members." Julian rose with practiced confidence, buttoning his jacket as conversations died down around the room. Claire watched him with what looked like dread. "Thank you, David, and thank you all for welcoming me into this incredible community." Julian's voice carried the warm sincerity he'd perfected over months of practice. "As many of you know, I've had the honor of joining the Rossi family, and tonight I want to share some exciting developments." He gestured toward an easel that had been set up near the podium, pulling away a cloth to reveal a professionally designed presentation board. "Rossi Vineyards, a vision for tomorrow," was emblazoned across the top in gold lettering. "Eleanor Rossi has built something truly remarkable over the past 4 decades," Julian continued, his eyes finding mine across the room. "But like all great enterprises, it's time for the next chapter. Beginning January 1st, Claire and I will be implementing a comprehensive modernization plan that will position Rossi Vineyards as the premier luxury destination in Napa Valley." Murmurs of interest rippled through the crowd. Julian had chosen his moment well. Everyone was relaxed, wine softened, ready to be impressed by ambitious plans and beautiful renderings. "We're talking about a complete transformation," he said, warming to his theme. "Premium guest accommodations, world-class dining experiences, exclusive vintages available only to our resort guests. We project a 300% increase in revenue within the first 2 years." More murmurs, these ones more enthusiastic. Nothing impressed Napa Valley investors like projected revenue increases. "Of course, this vision requires significant capital investment," Julian continued, "which is why I'm pleased to announce that we've secured backing from several prominent investment groups who share our commitment to excellence." That was my cue. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor loud enough to draw attention. Conversations died as heads turned in my direction. "Julian," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room, "that's a fascinating presentation." He smiled, but I caught the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Thank you, Eleanor. I hoped you'd approve." "Oh, I more than approve. I'm impressed by the thoroughness of your planning, the attention to detail, the confidence with which you've presented these projections." Julian's smile grew more genuine. Around the room, people relaxed, settling back to watch what they assumed would be a gracious passing of the torch. "There's just one small detail I'm curious about," I continued, reaching for the leather portfolio Martin handed me. "These investment groups you mentioned, are they the same ones you worked with in Oregon? Or perhaps the ones from Washington State?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Julian's hand tightened on his wine glass. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you do." I opened the portfolio and withdrew a thick stack of documents. "Martin Delgado, my attorney, has been doing some fascinating research into your business history. Would you like me to share what he found?" Julian's face had gone pale under his tan. "Eleanor, I think there might be some misunderstanding. No misunderstanding at all. For instance, did you know that Julian Hale Import Solutions declared bankruptcy in 2019, owing over $400,000 to suppliers across 3 states? A collective intake of breath swept the room. Julian's hand was shaking now, wine sloshing dangerously close to the rim of his glass. Or that Cascade Investment Group, Julian's restaurant venture in Washington, collapsed when investors discovered falsified financial statements? This is ridiculous, Julian said, his voice rising. I don't know where you're getting this information, but public records, mostly. Amazing what you can find when you know where to look. I pulled out another document. But my favorite discovery was this restraining order, filed by Patricia Morrison of Morrison Family Vineyards in Oregon. Apparently, Julian, you convinced Patricia's daughter to sign over power of attorney, then attempted to sell the family vineyard to cover your gambling debts. The silence in the room was absolute now. Julian looked like a man watching his execution. The really fascinating part, I continued, is the pattern. Wealthy older women with family businesses, whirlwind courtships, quick marriages, then systematic attempts to gain control of assets. I looked directly at Claire, who sat frozen in her chair. Patricia Morrison was 68 when you targeted her daughter. Margaret in Washington was 72. I'm 71. Quite a coincidence. You're lying, Julian said, but his voice cracked on the words. Am I? I pulled out a photograph. This is Julian with Margaret's daughter Sandra at their engagement party in Seattle. Notice anything familiar about his approach? The expensive gifts, the talk of modernization and expansion, the suggestions about assisted living for elderly relatives. Julian's glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the floor in a spray of red wine that looked like blood. The good news, I said, is that Julian's investors will be very interested to learn about his criminal history. The bad news is that those investors include several undercover FBI agents investigating financial fraud. That wasn't entirely true, but Julian didn't know that. What he knew was that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. Claire, he said, turning desperately to his wife, tell them this is insane. Tell them your mother is making this up because she doesn't want to give up control. Claire looked at him for a long moment, then at me, then back at him. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I want to see a divorce attorney. The room erupted. Conversations exploded at every table as people processed what they'd just witnessed. Several men in dark suits, Martin's private investigators, though Julian didn't know that, moved to block the exits. Julian looked around wildly, probably calculating his chances of reaching his car before someone called the police. But there was nowhere to run. Not anymore. Oh, and Julian, I said as he backed toward the door, about that conservatorship petition. Martin filed a counter-motion this morning, along with criminal fraud charges. You'll be hearing from the district attorney's office very soon. He turned and ran then, pushing through the crowd toward the exit. I didn't watch him go. Instead, I looked at my daughter, who sat surrounded by the wreckage of her marriage, tears streaming down her face. Claire, I said gently, let's go home. The district attorney's office moved faster than I'd expected. Within 72 hours, Julian's assets were frozen pending investigation. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had apparently been tracking him for months, waiting for enough evidence to build a solid case. Martin called with updates that felt like small victories. Julian's passport had been confiscated. His bail was set high enough that even his family's money couldn't cover it easily. 3 more victims had come forward, including a widow in Colorado who'd lost her cattle ranch to his schemes. He's looking at 15 to 20 years, Martin told me over coffee in my kitchen. The federal charges alone are enough to put him away for a long time. The hardest part was watching Claire pick up the pieces. She moved back to her apartment in San Francisco, filing for divorce and an annulment simultaneously. Her lawyer, Martin's recommendation, was optimistic about protecting her assets since the marriage had been so brief and Julian's fraud so well documented. But legal protection couldn't heal the deeper wounds. I feel so stupid, she told me during one of our phone calls. How could I not see what he was doing? He was very good at what he did, I said, And he told you exactly what you wanted to hear. That's what makes it worse. Some part of me knew, Mom. Some part of me knew he was using me, but I wanted to believe in the fairy tale so badly that I ignored every red flag. I understood that feeling better than she knew. We all want to believe in transformation, in love conquering practical concerns, in happy endings that don't require difficult choices. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came Claire's first visit to the vineyard since Julian's arrest. She looked thinner but somehow more solid, like pruning had revealed her true shape. "The vines look good," she said, walking beside me through the rows where she'd played as a child. She stopped beside a young vine I'd planted the year she was born, now thick-trunked and heavy with promise. "Mom, I owe you an apology. I let him convince me you were getting old, losing your edge. I let him turn me against you because it was easier than admitting I'd made a mistake." She touched one of the vine's emerging leaves. "You were right about everything. I nearly lost everything you, Dad, and Grandpa built." I handed her the pruning shears I'd been carrying. "The vines are strong, sweetheart. They just need care, just like us." She took the shears and considered the vine for a moment, then made a clean cut to remove a wayward branch. Her technique was perfect. I'd taught her well all those years ago. "Can I help with the harvest this year?" she asked. "I mean really help, not just show up for photos. I want to learn the business properly, from you." "I'd like that very much." That evening, we sat under the old oak tree with glasses of the wine Antonio and I had made together, the wine that had sustained me through Julian's siege. Claire asked questions about yields and soil composition, about weather patterns and harvest timing. Real questions, the kind that showed she was finally ready to see the vineyard as more than just a pretty backdrop for her childhood memories. "Julian thought he could charm his way into Rossi Vineyards," I said as the sun set behind the western hills. "But deep roots don't let go that easily." Claire raised her glass. "To deep roots." "To deep roots," I agreed. So, that's my story. I'd love to hear what you think. Should I have told Claire about Julian's fraud history the moment I discovered it? Or was I right to let her make her own mistakes first? Let me know in the comments and subscribe for more stories like mine.